These photos of strange, deformed daisies went viral online in 2015. The pictures were uploaded from Japan, and many people assumed the cause of the weirdness was radiation from the damaged Fukushima plant. You could understand why, because the photos were taken just 107 miles from the power station. Actually, biologists said right away there was nothing to worry about. The flower's deformation could have been caused by radiation, but it's a pretty common mutation in daisies that also occurs in areas where the radiation levels are totally normal. And this situation, in fact, perfectly describes what's happening with Fukushima. Everyone expects that after the accident, the area around it will be a barren wasteland, full of mutated animals. But in reality, the place is actually quite beautiful, just like any other area where there are few people and lots of wildlife. Abandoned rice paddies have dried up and become overgrown with grass, willows have spread into entire groves, chestnuts and persimmons once cultivated by the villagers now feed the abundant wildlife which thrives here. The dilapidated houses and fields seem to have become perfect breeding grounds for wild boars, and the boars have taken full advantage of it. People who've been to the exclusion zone around Fukushima say it feels like a ghost town. The residents have been evacuated, everything's abandoned, only nature remains, slowly taking over, creeping into the villages and farms. One of those places that looks like a zombie apocalypse movie set is the Abukuma Highlands. They're located about 15 miles northwest of the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant. This green area of hills and valleys is dotted with abandoned houses, and it's here that scientists spent months searching for snakes. Why? Just because. First, a little coffee, and I'll tell you everything. Just an unobtrusive reminder to hit the like button if you usually do that. So snakes. The scientists were driving along small winding mountain roads, tracking the animals that crossed them. When the weather got warm, more snakes would appear, and whenever someone spotted one, the scientists would jump out of the car and catch the animal. Afterward, the snake was taken to the lab at Fukushima University. Scientists wrapped its body with a piece of tape, then superglued a tiny GPS tracking device and an equally tiny dosimeter, a tool for measuring radiation, onto it. This guaranteed that the devices could be taken off afterward. Once all the procedures were done, the snake was returned to its natural habitat. 9 snakes went through the lab this way. These 9 snakes helped scientists measure radiation levels in the area around Fukushima Daiichi. At the time of the research, 10 years had passed since the accident. Back then, more than 160,000 people left the area of 310 square miles surrounding the plant as radioactive fallout spread. This, by the way, is about the size of New York City. Some people returned, but the area is still considered uninhabitable. To really understand how bad things are, scientists had to use snakes. Actually, at first it was just a guess, but then the research showed that radioactive contamination in the exclusion zone of Fukushima can really be measured by the snakes living there. Of course, it took some effort. First, the team identified 1,718 snake locations, tracking them for a month in the Abukuma Highlands. Well, I've already mentioned that. Then they measured radiation and found out that the radiocesium levels in the snakes had a high correlation with radiation levels in the soil where the snakes were caught. So the snakes living in the Fukushima exclusion zone, which is not recommended for human living, had radiocesium levels in their bodies approximately 22 times higher than those outside the zone. By the way, cesium-134 and cesium-137 radioactive nuclides of the chemical element cesium tend to bind to the soil and then make their way into the snake's muscle tissue. But why snakes specifically, and not, say, mice or moles? Some kind of birds? The thing is, rat snakes are an effective bioindicator of residual radioactivity. If you've never heard this word before, don't stress, I hadn't either. Turns out bioindicators are organisms that can signal the health of an ecosystem. And snakes are far from the only ones, and not just animals. Plants or other life forms can also be bioindicators. For example, lichens, which have no roots and depend on nutrients from the atmosphere, are bioindicators of air pollution. Something like canaries in the coal mine, just on a bigger scale. Amphibians like frogs and toads are also indicators of pollution. They have permeable skin through which the animals absorb both oxygen and toxins. That's why amphibians are really sensitive to changes in air and water quality. When people use pesticides, it's usually frogs and toads that suffer first, even if the pesticides are sprayed near their ecosystems and not right in them. Crayfish, in turn, can indicate the quality of fresh water since changes in acidity are stressful for them, well, and all that jazz. You can easily understand how nature's feeling. The important thing is to know where to look. But the exclusion zone isn't like just any regular pond next to a farm. Not every animal around Fukushima is good for serving as a bioindicator. The thing is, the radiocesium release from the nuclear disaster didn't cover the region evenly. Some areas got more, some got less. After all, it was an accident. And here lies the problem with bioindicator animals. For example, birds that travel long distances are exposed to pollutants all over the area, so they can't give us any info about pollution in smaller areas. They just pick up everything from all over. Moreover, in the decade following the nuclear disaster, most pollutants settled into the soil. This means that birds and other animals that spend most of their time in trees can provide very limited data on the contaminants in the ground. But snakes are a different story. They move around only short distances and can accumulate high levels of radionuclides because, well, they're snakes. Limited movement and close contact with contaminated soil are the key factors that make it possible to determine pollution levels using snakes. And just so you know, they really aren't the type to crawl off somewhere far away. The tracked rat snakes moved an average of just 213 feet a day. Plus, this species likes not only to slither on the ground, but also to burrow into it. A nice line to have on a bioindicator's resume. Well, as a bonus, snakes are the main predators in most ecosystems and live relatively long, which means they gather data on how the surrounding environment has changed over time. What else does a scientist need for happiness? Well, of course, snakes can be both predators and prey. They're pretty versatile specialists. Snakes are firmly in the number one spot in the bioindicator rankings, even though there are other animals in this top list, such as raccoon dogs or wild boars. They're actually pretty good indicators for the same reason. Wild boars enjoy rooting around in the dirt and can pick up similar radiation levels from the soil like snakes. That's why they also use wild boars. Scientists from the Institute of Environmental Radioactivity at Fukushima even specifically developed sensors for the boars, then attached them to the captured animals and took measurements. Overall, it's the same as with snakes, just with boars. By the way, the same group of researchers put sensors on wolves in Chernobyl. The device that scientists attached to the snakes allowed the team to physically pinpoint the location of each individual every few days to understand whether it was underground or slithering around in trees. While working in the hilly, rugged terrain of abandoned villages and farms, the scientists found snakes in trees, meadows, and along roadside streams. They also discovered that snakes avoid the interior of coniferous forests, but are often found in deciduous forests, along edges, and inside abandoned buildings. More than half of all tracked snakes spent time in abandoned barns and sheds. Maybe that's how they protect themselves from soil pollution. However, in the winter months, the risk of radiation exposure probably increases when snakes look for shelter underground. Thanks to the sensors, scientists were able to track the radiation levels, mainly radioactive cesium-134 and 137, in the bodies of snakes, depending on their location and movement. They also identified over 1,700 spots in the region that the snakes visited. Scientists also found that levels of radioactive contamination are now much lower than they were right after the accident. Overall, it's a pretty logical outcome. Pollutants naturally decay over time. At the same time, radiation levels vary a lot depending on the area, even in spots that are pretty close to each other. This further confirms that radioactive materials released from the disaster didn't fall or accumulate evenly across the affected territories. Also, we now know that part of the radiation exposure for snakes in the Fukushima exclusion zone comes from the contaminated prey they eat. But most of it, 80%, still comes from contact with contaminated soil, trees, and plants. It might seem obvious, like why even bother doing research on this? It's clear that if you keep crawling around in contaminated soil, you'll pick up radiation. But thanks to snakes, scientists have gained a better understanding of radiation's overall effects. For example, snakes showed a lower level of radiation when they spent a lot of time in trees. And this is despite the fact that the trees also have traces of pollution. Snakes living in buildings showed even lower levels of radiation, so buildings can act as a sort of shield against radiation, although I thought no walls could defend against it. But snakes prove the opposite. Wait a minute, we're talking about snakes accumulating radiation and all that? Does this mean there are dozens or even hundreds of mutant snakes slithering around the exclusion zone around Fukushima? Well, it turns out the research with sensors attached to the snakes didn't consider the effects of radiation on the snakes themselves at all. Scientists admit this question definitely needs more work, but they still have some idea. For example, at the population level, snakes haven't really suffered from radiation. I mean, there wasn't any sudden extinction, decrease in numbers, or diseases, but at the cellular level, things might be happening that we don't know about. Snakes can definitely go through some internal changes. And no, you can't even guess which ones in theory. Why? It turns out that scientists know the radiation levels that harm mammals, birds, and frogs, but not snakes. For some reason, snakes have slipped through the cracks of science. Anyway, even if snakes didn't turn into mutants, other animals weren't so lucky. For example, 3 generations of butterflies living near the Fukushima nuclear power plant were found to have genetic mutations. Scientists even estimated that about 12% of the butterflies that were exposed to radioactive fallout in their larval stage right after the disaster had abnormalities, including smaller wings and damaged eyes. In the second generation, similar problems were observed in 18% of cases. In the third generation of butterflies, this number rose to 34%, even though one parent from each mating was from a population unaffected by the disease. These, for example, are dented eyes, a direct result of radiation exposure. It's unclear, though, how exactly they affect the butterfly's vision, but it's unlikely that such an anomaly is beneficial. Other consequences include the deformation of the wings, their size and shape, the right rear wing, which is much smaller than the left, or even folded, crumpled wings. I doubt that you can fly with those at all. Radiation often damages butterflies' antennae or feelers, and it seems like the insect got hurt bumping into something while flying. There are also more harmless anomalies like extra spots on the wings, but only experienced butterfly experts will notice them. What about the other animals? The accident at Fukushima actually made people leave, and it had a positive effect on nature. Over the last decade, animals and plants have reclaimed the exclusion zone. The radiation levels there are still too high for people to return safely, but wildlife doesn't have dosimeters. For example, wild boars, Japanese macaques, and raccoon dogs are now more numerous in the exclusion zone, despite a higher level of radiation than in nearby areas. There are no people there, so the animals are comfortable. A similar phenomenon was observed in the exclusion zone around Chernobyl, so this is a kind of international practice. However, don't just think that animals simply shrug off the negative effects. Research on wild animals of various species living in the Fukushima exclusion zone found almost no negative consequences from the nuclear power plant accident, at least not for their DNA. Well, except for the butterflies. When scientists went out to study animals, they quickly came to the conclusion that they looked perfectly normal. Nobody seemed to be suffering from radiation or even sick. Further research only confirmed this. Moreover, they show that animals have thrived in areas that are now deserted by humans, despite radioactive fallout and other aftermaths of the disaster. This doesn't mean that radiation doesn't harm animals at all, but the scale of such effects, especially from low doses, remains a topic of debate. And when you compare it to the impact on humans, it seems like animals are doing just fine. See for yourself. One of the worst effects of radiation on people is cancer. But cancer doesn't always appear in wild animals, since some of them don't live long enough for cell mutations to accumulate and turn into an illness. On the contrary, some animals actually feel better with radiation. When scientists measured the stress levels in wild boars, they found it was lower than in animals from other areas. This is linked to the fact that boars in the exclusion zone have less contact with humans, and we are always a source of stress for animals. So radiation definitely affects land and underground animals, but they not only don't suffer from it, they're actually concentrated right in the center of the area with the highest level of contamination. Scientists aren't really sure what the exact reason is, but they suspect that this is how animals avoid humans. But with birds, it's a whole different story. Despite the fact that radioactivity has gone down throughout the region over the past 10 years since the accident, many bird species and their populations are plummeting. And each year, things keep getting worse. Just go a couple of miles away from the safe zone closer to Fukushima, and you'll immediately feel the difference. There's this heavy silence. If you're lucky, you might see 1 or 2 birds at most. Also, the birds in the contaminated areas had white spots on their feathers. Scientists believe these white spots are a result of oxidative stress caused by radiation, which depletes the antioxidant levels in birds that control the color of their feathers and other body parts. In simple terms, radiation makes the birds fade in patches, compared to wild boars, which just go about their wild boar lives, actively reproduce, and don't worry about anything at all. It seems especially sad. Fortunately for the whole planet, nuclear accidents are rare, and that's why we have very little data on the direct effects of such radiation on wildlife. Maybe in the future we'll find out something new. In recent years, many evacuation orders for people from the exclusion zone have been canceled. Residents of the Fukushima area have started returning and faced an unexpected problem. No, not radiation, and not even strange butterflies. It's about macaque monkeys. Before the disaster, the monkeys never came to human settlements, but after the catastrophe, the boundary between monkeys and people faded. While the locals were in a safe place, their homes stood empty, but the trees in the gardens were still bearing fruit: plums, pears, chestnuts, persimmons, a true paradise for monkeys. And they rightly decided that this completely human-free safe spot with tons of food was their new home. Then people came back, and now they have to share their homes with monkeys. The local government subsidizes fireworks to scare off the monkeys. It's meant to scare them, not to harm them, but the effect lasts only a few days. After that, the monkeys calm down and come back. They have to scare them off again because the monkeys already see the crops and the gardens as their own stash and aren't planning to share. The authorities also provided several different types of tools like boar traps and electric fences to protect the villages from animals. And here's the funny thing. 70 years ago, some locals actually wanted to attract monkeys to the village to boost tourism. Back then, it didn't work out. They were too scared of people to come down from the mountains and hang around human settlements. But the Fukushima disaster changed everything. Now people can't get rid of the monkeys just because there are fewer people. Half the houses are still empty and only elderly residents have returned to the villages. To win the war against the monkeys, that's not enough. Still, the lives of monkeys aren't as pleasant as it might seem at first glance. They found blood abnormalities linked to radioactive fallout after the disaster, which could make the animals more susceptible to infectious diseases. Scientists believe that the primary cause lies in their diet. During snowy winters, monkeys primarily consume buds and tree bark, which contain high concentrations of cesium. This is bound to have an impact on their health. There's even a list of changes that have happened to the monkeys. First, they're smaller in size. The Japanese monkeys born in the rainfall area after the Fukushima disaster weigh less relative to their height. Second, besides having a lower weight, they also have smaller heads. And the brain is smaller too. Scientists know from the examples of Hiroshima and Nagasaki that embryos and fetuses exposed to radiation in the womb have a low birth weight and also microcephaly. This means the brain just doesn't develop properly, and the same thing is observed in macaques. And thirdly, anemia. Monkeys exhibit a decrease in all blood components: red blood cells, white blood cells, hemoglobin, and the bone marrow cells that produce blood components. Well, something similar was observed in people affected by the Chernobyl disaster. After all, monkeys are just too similar to us. Snakes explore the reactor. In February 2024, Japan sent 2 mini drones and a snake-shaped robot into one of the 3 nuclear reactors at the Fukushima nuclear power plant. All 3 devices were used during the preparations for the removal of hundreds of tons of highly radioactive fuel and debris. It's no wonder this sounds like a very complicated task. It's predicted that this risky operation will take decades to complete. The company that created the devices says the reactor's interior is tight and dark, so a snake-shaped robot with a wireless communications relay is just what's needed. They actually took photos from inside the reactor, with the equipment snapping shots of each other. It feels like something straight out of the future. Here's, for example, a view of a snake-like robot peeking into the reactor of the first power unit, and here the drone is trying to identify orange structures resembling boulders, but most likely it's melted fuel or equipment. And this is another view inside Unit 1. There's that typical radiation noise all over, making the pictures look grainy. Radiation kills. So what's new, you might say? And you'd be right, because the deadly effects of radiation have been known for quite some time. But usually they affect living beings, not robots. However, remotely controlled robots sent to the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant site back in 2016 died because of the incredibly large amounts of leaked radioactive materials. The substances simply destroyed their wiring, The robots were specifically designed to swim through underwater tunnels of now-defunct cooling pools and remove hundreds of extremely dangerous clumps of molten fuel rods. They sent them there because the company maintaining the facility couldn't come up with a way to clear the water of radioactive materials and all the other stuff left behind at the site for quite a while. In general, the idea of using robots wasn't a bad one, and they were specifically built for that kind of job, but something didn't go as planned. Radioactive boar hybrids. According to a recent study, the Fukushima accident in 2011 led to the emergence of a unique type of wild boar. Researchers studying the impact of the nuclear disaster on animals in the area report that radiation hasn't negatively affected their genetics, but wild boars have bred by mating with domestic pigs, which escaped from nearby farms after farmers had to evacuate. As a result, a new hybrid species emerged, and even though these animals are radioactive, the study doesn't link radioactivity to the creation of the new hybrid species. Actually, it makes sense. Wild boars crossbreed with domestic pigs even without nuclear power plant disasters. Sunflower exclusion zone. The consequences of the Fukushima 1 nuclear disaster are still felt today, and Japan is trying to find ways to deal with thousands of tons of radioactive wastewater and solid waste. But among all the high-tech solutions, there's one cleanup program you may have missed: sunflowers. As it turns out, sunflowers are great at cleaning up the environment from radioactive waste, which is why they were planted en masse after the Chernobyl disaster in 1986. And when the disaster happened in Japan, scientists started planting them there too. The good thing about sunflowers is that they grow fast, easily, and practically anywhere. What's even better is that they store most of their biomass in the leaves and stems, so the radioactive material absorbed by the plants can be disposed of without needing to dig up the root. If you've ever dug up any roots, you know that's really hard work. It's true that there's a downside. Despite the success in Chernobyl, attempts to clean the land of radioactive isotopes in Fukushima ultimately turned out to be unsuccessful. There aren't many sources on this experiment, but several analyses failed to find a single plant that worked effectively. This shouldn't be surprising since there were too many differences between Fukushima and Chernobyl. Still, it's a bit disappointing. For the sake of animals. Two men who aren't related and live in the 12-mile zone around the damaged reactor chose not to evacuate when the disaster happened. They still live near Fukushima, completely alone, looking after dozens of abandoned animals that people left behind after the evacuation order. After it became clear that no one would return to this area, the men started untying the dogs from the trees, letting the cows out of the barns, and feeding all the animals that needed it. Even the wild boars, because, well, why not? Unfortunately, this selflessness hasn't come without a price. One of the men is considered the most irradiated person in the country, but it'll be 30 to 40 years before the radiation starts breaking down his biology. However, the guy's already over 50, and he says that he'll probably be dead by then. At least this way he can help the animals. Let's wish him good health. And you owe me a like. See you later.